The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in glass, and nobody at St. Michael's Hospital in Raleigh had any idea they were standing next to a legend. Hannah Clarke moved through the surgical ward with the kind of invisible competence that made her dangerous. 3 years on the job, a nursing degree from a state university framed in her apartment, personnel files showing nothing but exemplary reviews, and a quiet efficiency that made senior staff forget she was in the room. The smell of antiseptic and stale coffee hung in the corridors like a permanent fog. Cold stainless steel gleamed under the harsh white light of the operating theaters. She was exactly what she appeared to be, a capable nurse who knew her place in the hierarchy and kept her head down. Dead wrong. Her hands told a different story, though nobody was looking close enough to read it. The scars ran across her knuckles in precise lines, old ones, the kind that came from field medicine under fire, from holding bandages against wounds while mortar rounds shook the ground. She wore them the way other people wore jewelry, unremarkable, until you understood what they meant. Today she wore her scrubs like a uniform, moving between patient rooms with the economical efficiency of someone who'd learned that every step either healed or killed. The fabric felt familiar against her skin, but not in the way a civilian nurse would understand familiar. Familiar the way a weapon becomes familiar when you've relied on it to stay alive. St. Michael's had been her posting for exactly 3 years and 2 months. 38 months of monitoring a single patient who didn't know he was being watched, of collecting intelligence that moved through channels nobody in this hospital could imagine existed. Army Sergeant Marcus Webb had arrived at St. Michael's 8 weeks ago with injuries that the official report called traumatic and the classified briefing called suspicious. Shrapnel wounds from an IED explosion near Ramadi, that part was true. But the Pentagon suspected the explosion wasn't random. The arms trafficking operation running through the VA system had killed 2 soldiers already, maybe more. Marcus Webb's convoy had been hit by weapons that matched serial numbers from a black market cache that moved through 3 different countries before landing in the hands of people who wanted American soldiers dead. Hannah had been placed at St. Michael's to watch him, to see who visited, what conversations happened in his room, whether anyone tried to silence him before he could talk to the FBI. It wasn't a career. It was a mission. And the mission was failing. Marcus Webb was scheduled for discharge in 4 days. He hadn't talked to anyone. Nobody suspicious had visited his room. The investigation had stalled into the kind of dead silence that meant either the conspiracy had scattered or Hannah was missing something obvious, something that would require her to reveal herself and blow 3 years of cover to pursue. 3 years of being just a nurse. 3 years of watching Dr. Pierce, the head of the surgical department, treat her like she was something he'd stepped in during morning rounds. Pierce had hated her from the moment she corrected his medication dosage during a code blue in month 2. The patient was crashing, a 73-year-old man with a failing heart, and Pierce had ordered 15 milligrams of epinephrine instead of 1.5, a 10-fold overdose that would have stopped the man's heart permanently. Hannah hadn't hesitated. She hadn't asked permission. She'd simply said, 1.5, doctor, in a voice like a door closing. The correction had registered in the room, 30 residents, 3 attending physicians, the entire surgical team heard it. The patient survived. Pierce's reputation took a hit that he spent months rebuilding. And from that moment forward, he'd made it his personal mission to remind her of her place in the hierarchy. His voice had the quality of a man accustomed to being right, to having his authority accepted without question. He was in his 50s, silver-threaded hair kept meticulously styled, a man who wore his credentials like medals. Board certification in thoracic surgery. Fellowship training at Johns Hopkins. 27 years of climbing the institutional ladder, and then a floor nurse, someone with a state university degree and 2 hands that moved with the certainty of someone who'd seen things he couldn't imagine, had corrected him in front of 30 people. The thing he didn't understand, the thing that made him dangerous, was that Hannah Clarke hadn't done it to embarrass him. She'd done it because the patient's life mattered more than his pride. To Pierce, this represented something unbearable, a nurse acting above her station, demonstrating competence without the decades of credentials he'd accumulated, showing respect for the hierarchy by breaking it when it mattered. He decided, somewhere in the first weeks after the code blue, that she needed to be taught a lesson about appropriate station and deference. She didn't wear her military insignia anywhere he could see it. Instead, she kept it close, the way soldiers kept things close when they were operating in hostile territory. Inside her locker, folded with the kind of precision only training could produce, was a small American flag, the one her teammate had carried into Ramadi 3 years ago. Sergeant Daniel Holloway. It had been folded into her hands by a chaplain at a memorial service that didn't exist in any official record, at a base that wasn't on any public map. The flag had been in that cardboard box ever since she'd arrived at St. Michael's, wrapped in tissue paper, a small rebellion against the compartmentalization her mission required. Seeing it every morning when she opened her locker was the only thing that kept her connected to who she actually was when she was pretending to be someone else. Today was Tuesday, 7:14 a.m., and the ward was already electric with the kind of tension that came with Pierce doing grand rounds. He moved through the hallways like a general surveying conquered territory, trailing residents who scribbled notes and nodded at every pronouncement he made. The surgical department operated according to a hierarchy that Pierce had designed and enforced with the precision of a military commander, except his weapons were reputation and institutional power instead of rank and orders. He was competent. That was the dangerous part. He wasn't just a bully who yelled. He was a strategist who understood exactly how far he could push before it became actionable. Hannah was reviewing post-op vitals in the ICU when she heard his voice echo down the corridor. "Where is Nurse Clarke?" The room went quiet. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm undisturbed. The heart monitors beat their steady patterns. And Hannah continued writing in the patient chart, her hand steady as surgical steel, while she waited for whatever this was to unfold. "She's finishing rounds, sir," someone said. "A resident, probably. Young enough not to understand the warning signs." "Bring her to grand rounds in conference room B in 5 minutes, Pierce said. "I want her there for the case review." Hannah closed the chart and walked toward the conference room. Not hurried. Not slow. Exactly the pace a nurse would walk when summoned by the department head. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she moved through corridors she'd navigated for 3 years without incident. Without being remarkable. Without anyone seeing what she actually was. She had no idea that the next 52 minutes would change everything. The grand rounds began at 8:33 a.m. on a Wednesday. 30 residents gathered in a semicircle around the teaching bed like vultures sensing weakness. Dr. Pierce stood at the center, his tailored coat pressed sharp enough to draw blood, his voice carrying the particular cruelty of men who'd never been told no. Hannah stood at the back of the group, her badge clipped to her scrubs, her hands folded low where no one would notice the calluses across her knuckles, marks left behind by years of something other than hospital work. Pierce pointed toward a patient chart on the monitor, his expression settling into something that looked almost like a smile. "This case," Pierce announced, his tone suggesting he was about to dissect incompetence, "represents exactly what happens when nursing protocols override clinical judgment." He turned slowly, his eyes finding Hannah in the crowd with the precision of a hunter spotting prey. Nurse Clarke's approach to this admission was, shall we say, textbook. Elementary. Lacking the kind of medical insight that separates adequate nursing from exceptional clinical thinking. The silence that followed was the silence of people watching someone get dismantled in public. 30 residents. 30 witnesses. Pierce gestured toward Hannah without looking directly at her. When you rely purely on protocol without understanding the underlying pathophysiology, you become dangerous. You become what we call a liability. Hannah's jaw tightened, just barely, a small muscle contraction no one watching would have caught unless they were looking for it. Her hands didn't move. Her breathing didn't change. She simply stood there, absorbing the words like antiseptic absorbing into gauze, and said nothing. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their mechanical indifference. One of the residents shifted his weight, uncomfortable. Another looked at his shoes. Pierce continued for another 3 minutes, dissecting her charting line by line, her medication verification timing, her patient assessment documentation, each criticism delivered with the precision of someone who'd practiced the humiliation ahead of time. When he finished, he turned back to the group. Textbook nursing has its place. Just not at a level 1 trauma center. Hannah waited until the group began to disperse before she walked out, her spine perfectly straight, her face revealing nothing. But that wasn't the worst part. By Thursday morning, rumors had begun moving through the hospital like blood through contaminated lines. Pierce had started making calls, 3 phone calls, according to the whispers Hannah overheard near the medication dispensary at 6:13 a.m. Calls to board members. Calls to people with authority that extended beyond the hospital walls. The first story appeared in the staff lounge. Hannah's nursing degree, someone said, had been checked against the database and there were inconsistencies. No specifics, just whispers. I heard she didn't actually graduate, one of the OR nurses told another, loud enough for Hannah to hear as she passed with a stack of patient charts. I heard she falsified transcripts. By Friday, someone had noticed the way Hannah's hands moved during and for insertion, too steady, too practiced, like someone who'd done this under conditions that had nothing to do with civilian emergency rooms. Military training, someone whispered. And then it evolved. Stolen valor, one of the nurses said, loud and deliberate, when Hannah walked past the break room. People claiming military service they never did. It's becoming an epidemic. The accusation hung in the air like something poisonous that no one could quite prove, but everyone seemed willing to believe. The vending machine sat in the East Corridor at 2:38 p.m. on Friday afternoon. Hannah was reaching for a coffee when she heard them, Sarah Mitchell and Jennifer Okafor, 2 nurses she'd worked alongside for 8 months, 2 nurses whose shifts she'd covered when their children were sick, 2 nurses she'd considered something close to friends. They turned the corner together, their conversation stopping mid-sentence the moment they saw her. Sarah's expression shifted. Jennifer's did the same. Without a word, without even the courtesy of eye contact, they turned their backs and walked away, their laughter following them down the corridor like a knife. The laughter was the worst part, not anger, not confrontation, but the casual dismissal of someone who'd simply stopped mattering. Hannah took her coffee and didn't move. Didn't flinch. Didn't follow them down the hallway with some explanation or apology. She inserted her dollar bill and waited for the machine to dispense the cup, her movements mechanical, precise, the kind of control that comes from having learned control in places where losing it meant someone died. Pierce found her at 2:51 p.m., 3 minutes after the vending machine encounter, as if he'd been watching and waiting for exactly this moment. He rounded the corner with 2 security officers, actual security officers, uniformed, professional, but their presence transformed the hallway into something different entirely. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet. Reasonable. The kind of tone people use when they're about to do something permanent. Nurse Clarke, I'm going to need you to understand the severity of what we're discussing here. I've contacted your references. I've initiated a review of your credentials with the state board. I've got investigators looking into your background, and frankly, the picture that's emerging is not one this institution can afford to associate with. He paused, letting the weight of it settle. I'm going to have security escort you out of this building before you embarrass us any further. Not today, necessarily, but soon. You understand what I'm telling you. Hannah stood there with her coffee in her hand, looking at Pierce with a kind of expression that might have been anything, acceptance, defiance, resignation, but was actually nothing at all. Just a blank screen where emotion used to be. I understand, she said quietly. That was all. Not a defense. Not an argument. Not an explanation she couldn't give without destroying 3 years of classified intelligence work. Just 2 words, delivered with the kind of flatness that suggested she'd heard worse things from better men. By Saturday, the isolation was complete. She came in for the morning shift and found her assigned patients had been redistributed. She moved to help with an admission and the charge nurse, Margaret, someone Hannah had mentored, redirected her to chart review instead. Her access to the staff break room wasn't revoked, but when she entered it, conversation stopped. By Sunday afternoon, she wasn't scheduled for Monday. She checked the staffing board 3 times, but the conclusion was the same. The roster that went up at 3:22 p.m. had her name removed, replacement nurses scheduled for her shifts, her name erased from the structure of the hospital like she'd never been there. She sat in her car in the parking lot for 40 minutes, her hands on the steering wheel, not crying. She wouldn't cry in a place Pierce could potentially see it, but something in her chest had begun calculating odds and assets and escape routes the way military minds do when extraction becomes necessary. The rain started around 4:06 p.m., soft at first, then harder, percussion against the windshield like rounds from a distant firefight. She thought about Sergeant Webb, still recovering in a VA facility 3 hours away, still ignorant that the nurse who'd been assigned to monitor him had just been erased from the institution. She thought about her son, still deployed, still under Webb's command, still unaware that his mother's cover was collapsing. And that's when the call came, a number she recognized, a voice she hadn't heard in 19 hours. "Captain Clarke, we have a situation," the voice said. Not a request. A command, delivered through a secure line, military protocol even in crisis. "We need you back at St. Michael's. Tonight. It's about the Webb investigation." Hannah's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "I'm terminated," she said flatly. "Effective immediately." "Pierce," the voice interrupted her. "We know. We don't care. There's a patient coming in at approximately 3:51 a.m., former detainee from Ramadi, turned informant, protected witness status. Shot during transport. He's being taken to St. Michael's because that's where you are. The FBI needs you in the building when he arrives. Can you be there?" Hannah looked at the rain hammering against the windshield, the parking lot already dark, the hospital behind her shutting down for the night. In 3 years of this assignment, of standing perfectly still while Pierce dismantled her professionally, of maintaining composure while her reputation dissolved, she'd never broken protocol, never exposed herself, never prioritized her own survival over the mission. She wasn't about to start now. "I'll be there," she said, and she was already turning the key in the ignition, already moving, already becoming something other than the nurse the hospital thought it had destroyed. The ER doors burst open at 2:13 a.m. with the kind of urgency that made the fluorescent light seem dim by comparison. Sergeant Marcus Webb came through on a stretcher, his chest heaving in the wrong way, asymmetrical, one side rising while the other collapsed inward like a fist closing. His trachea was deviated so far left that Hannah could see it from across the room, a visible ridge in his neck where the anatomy had gone catastrophically wrong. Tension pneumothorax. The words formed in her mind before her conscious thought caught up, before the civilian part of her remembered she was supposed to be just a nurse, before everything else fell away. The on-call resident, Dr. Patterson, stood frozen at the foot of the bed. 28 years old. Fresh out of fellowship. Hands trembling as he stared at the vital monitor where oxygen saturation was already dropping, 96, then 94, then 92 in the span of 4 heartbeats. Someone called for an attending. Someone else was fumbling with a chest X-ray machine that would take 3 minutes to set up, 3 minutes they did not have. The ventilator hadn't arrived yet. The central line kit was still in the supply closet. Everyone was moving like they were underwater, like their bodies understood urgency but their training had locked up. Hannah was already moving. Not walking. Moving. The kind of movement that came from muscle memory older than her nursing license, from 17 years of muscle memory that had nothing to do with a stethoscope or 4 lines. She could see Webb's eyes, pale blue, terrified, drowning in air. She had seen that look before. She had seen it in a field hospital in Ramadi when a corpsman with shrapnel through his lung lay on a cot that smelled like diesel and blood and the particular copper stench of a bunker under fire. That was 3,000 miles and 3 years ago. That was when she was something other than Hannah Clarke, RN. That was when her hands knew different things. "Step back, doctor," she said to Patterson. Not a request. Her voice had changed. 6 words, but the tone underneath them was an order, and Patterson moved without thinking, muscle memory of his own responding to the command structure in her voice, to something in the way she said step that meant now. She was already reaching for the needle. 14 gauge. The largest bore they kept in the crash cart. Her fingers knew exactly where it was before her eyes found it. She could hear her own breathing, controlled, steady, the kind of breathing that came from having done this while rounds of small arms fire rattled against concrete walls. Around her, the other nurses and the resident were staring. The monitor was still dropping. 90, 88. She could feel time pressing down like weight. Second intercostal space, she said, more to herself than anyone else. The word slipped out in the clinical language of trauma protocol, the language that belonged to a different job, a different identity. Midclavicular line. The resident's eyes widened. No civilian nurse talked like that. No civilian nurse had that tone when she said it. She could see the landmarks on Webb's chest, the rib cage, the space between ribs that was maybe a centimeter wide at best. Her hand moved to position the needle at a 90-degree angle. The skin was cold. Goosebumps everywhere. His oxygen sat was 86 now. The tachycardia on the monitor was climbing toward 140. She could see his neck muscles straining, could see the desperation in his pupils, could see that he was going to arrest if someone did not do this in the next 30 seconds. Her hands were steady. Not shaking. Not hesitating. The kind of steady that came from practicing this in a field hospital tent while mortar rounds walked their way across the base perimeter, from threading needles and lines and catheters while watching for shadows in the medical bay entrance that might mean the perimeter had been breached. Restraint, one of the older nurses would say later, trying to describe what she had just watched. Her hands weren't trembling. But you could see the control in them. Like she was holding back an enormous amount of force. The needle went in. One motion. Clean. Subcutaneous layer first, then through the intercostal muscle, then into the pleural space where the pressure was building, where the air was crushing Webb's lung and his heart and his diaphragm against his spine. The moment the needle tip broke through, the hiss. That distinctive, unmistakable hiss of air escaping, of pressure releasing, of physics and anatomy and chemistry all suddenly working in the correct direction instead of the wrong one. Hannah's eyes had closed for just a moment. Not from relief. Not from emotion. From recognition. She had heard that exact sound before. In the dark. In a place where the walls were sandbags and the roof was corrugated metal and there was always the distant sound of something larger trying to kill you. The monitor began its climb. Oxygen saturation responding to the pressure release, to the lung expanding again, to the emergency that was suddenly no longer an emergency. 88, the hiss continued as air continued to escape. 92, 95. The oxygen curve on the monitor turned upward like a prayer getting answered. 97, the tachycardia was dropping already as Webb's autonomic nervous system realized, at the cellular level, that the body was no longer suffocating. 98, normal sinus rhythm. Steady. Strong. Alive. Patterson was staring at her. The nurses were staring at her. Someone had forgotten to breathe and was now remembering how. The only sound in the trauma bay was the ventilator that had finally arrived, too late to be necessary, and the monitor beeping its steady confirmation that catastrophe had been averted. "Get a chest tube kit," Hannah said, her voice dropping even lower, even more authoritative. Not asking. Commanding. And prep for imaging. We need to confirm lung re-expansion and rule out secondary pneumothorax. Nobody moved. Now, she added. One word. Just one. And suddenly the entire trauma team was moving, executing the orders with the precision of people who understood they were in the presence of someone who knew what she was doing with a certainty that transcended normal hierarchy. The needle stayed in place, a temporary bridge. The hiss had stopped. Webb's oxygen levels were holding at 99%. His blood pressure, which had been crashing into the low 70s, was climbing back toward something approximating normal. 92 systolic. 98. 104. The crisis was over. 30 seconds. That was all it had taken to change the entire trajectory of the night from death to recovery. Hannah stepped back from the bed, still moving with that same fluid precision, and that was when she saw it. Saw what she had been trying very hard not to look at for the past 3 years. Webb's left forearm, bare from where they had cut away his sleeve for 4 access, where a tattoo was visible. A call sign. Her unit's insignia. The number 3 beneath it. He had been under her command in Ramadi. He had been there the day the field hospital took fire. He had been one of the 17 soldiers she had triaged in that particular rotation, and 3 of them had not made it off the base alive, and she had been the one who had to decide which ones got the blood and plasma and antibiotics, which ones got the comfort measures, which ones got the chance. And now he was staring at her with recognition beginning to dawn in his eyes, recognition that came from oxygen returning to a brain that had been starved of it, from consciousness returning with clarity, and she could see the moment the pieces started connecting in his mind, the moment he began to understand that the nurse who had just saved his life in the middle of the night in Raleigh, North Carolina, was someone he had known in a war 3,000 miles away. The room was very quiet. Patterson was opening his mouth to ask a question. One of the nurses was reaching for the chest tube kit. And Hannah Clarke, who had spent 3 years being called incompetent and overstepping, who had spent 3 years accepting humiliation with perfect composure, who had spent 3 years as someone other than who she actually was about to have every single lie she had told exposed by a man's recognition and a tattoo and a memory of a place where people died, and she had held their hands while they went. The needle went in. Intercostal space, second rib, midclavicular line. Hannah's hands moved on their own, muscle memory overriding the sterile civilian persona she'd worn for 3 years. The 14-gauge angiocath slid through skin and fascia with the familiar resistance of flesh giving way to purpose. A hiss of air escaped, the pneumothorax bleeding out, the pressure that had been crushing Webb's lungs finally releasing. The on-call resident stood frozen beside the stretcher, his phone still in his hand, his jaw slack. He was trying to dial. He was always trying to dial. Hannah had already stopped the bleeding, already saved the life, already done the thing he'd been trained to do and failed to attempt. The monitor's rhythm shifted. Sinus rhythm. Steady. The oxygen saturation climbed from 68 to 74 to 82. Webb's chest rose and fell with the mechanical cooperation of a body that could breathe again. His eyes fluttered, consciousness returning, the fog of hypoxia lifting. Hannah stepped back, peeling off the gloves with 2 fingers, the latex snapping against itself like a closing fist. Around her, the night shift nurses stood motionless. The room had gone dead silent. That kind of silence that happens when someone does something they aren't supposed to know how to do. When a nurse's hands move with the precision of someone who has performed emergency decompression under mortar fire in a field hospital in Ramadi where the power went out at 2:33 a.m. and she kept working by flashlight held between her teeth because stopping meant watching a man die for the sake of protocol. Webb's eyes found hers. His hand, trembling but conscious, reached for her wrist. His voice came rough, barely audible. "Angel. The tattoo. You're the angel of Ramadi." Hannah pulled her hand back. "Wrong patient," she said quietly, and turned toward the medication cart as if the crisis had ended, as if the real crisis hadn't just begun. The next words out of his mouth changed everything. Dr. Pierce's voice cut through the silence like something sharp, something that had been waiting for the exact moment she'd exposed herself. "What the hell just happened here?" He was standing in the doorway, 6'2" of accumulated privilege and wounded pride, his face the color of fluorescent lighting. Behind him, a nurse he'd promoted 3 weeks ago. His informant. His network. Pierce moved into the room with the stride of a man who'd just been handed a weapon he'd been sharpening for 3 years. His eyes locked on Hannah's. Not with anger. With certainty. "Security escort this nurse out of the building. Now," he said. The patient was in crisis, Hannah said. Tension pneumothorax. The resident was frozen. "You are not qualified to make that call. You are a floor nurse. You performed an emergency procedure without physician authorization. That is practicing beyond your scope of practice, and it is a violation of your credentials that will end your career." He turned to the resident, who was now fumbling with the chest tube kit that Hannah's intervention had made unnecessary. "Document this incident. Every detail. This goes to administration and the state nursing board." Hannah didn't argue. That was the mistake people always made with commanders like Pierce. They defended themselves. They explained. They gave him ammunition. Instead, she untied her badge and handed it to the nearest nurse. Get him to ICU. Monitor for recurrence. He'll need a chest X-ray to confirm full re-expansion. She looked at the resident. His name was Dr. Holder. He was 28 and had family money and the kind of freeze response that got soldiers killed in actual combat. You should have called me 5 minutes ago when you recognized the presentation. She walked toward the locker room before Pierce could respond, before he could escalate, before anyone could see that the exposure had begun and there was nothing left to do but pack. What they didn't know was that Pierce had already made the first call. By 3:14 a.m., while Hannah removed her name tag from a locker that still smelled like coffee and antiseptic, his phone was ringing into the homes of board members. 3 calls. 3 wealthy men who owed Pierce favors. 3 voices carrying the same message: we have a serious credentialing issue that needs immediate attention. A nurse with a fraudulent degree. Someone's falsifying records at our institution. By noon, the State Nursing Board had received a formal complaint, filed under his name, alleging that Hannah Clarke's degree from the University of North Carolina was a fabrication. By 6:16 p.m., a private investigator with a subpoena was calling the registrar's office, disrupting records, asking questions that couldn't be answered without compromising 3 years of federal intelligence work. By 7:33 p.m., the investigator had contacted her listed references, all fake numbers routed to burner phones, and the missing responses created the perfect narrative of a career built on lies. Pierce had built his case with the precision of a man who understood institutional power. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten Hannah directly. He simply activated the machinery of bureaucracy, the machinery he'd spent decades learning to operate. 3 board members, 1 state agency, 1 private investigator. The network. The favor economy. The unspoken agreement among men that someone like Hannah, competent, younger, female, not part of the system, needed to be eliminated not with a sword but with 1,000 small cuts to her credibility. By Friday morning, 6:13 a.m., the hospital administrator called Hannah into his office. She could see it in his face before he spoke. The decision had already been made. The calls had been made. The investigation was serious enough that they couldn't allow her to continue. "We're terminating your employment, effective immediately," he said. "It's for credentialing irregularities. You understand we have to protect the hospital from liability." Hannah nodded once. She didn't speak. She didn't defend herself. She removed her badge and set it on his desk, and walked back to her locker for the last time, and cleared out the things that belonged to a person named Hannah Clarke, RN. A coffee mug from 3 years of overnight shifts. A dying succulent someone had given her. A carefully folded American flag, still in its ceremonial triangle, from a teammate killed in Ramadi in 2009. The only piece of her real life she'd allowed herself to keep. The rain started at 8:22 p.m. Not the gentle kind. The kind that hammered the pavement like applause, like the world was celebrating something, like the decision to end her was written into the weather itself. Hannah sat on a bench at the bus stop on Fayetteville Street, her cardboard box balanced on her knees, the flag protected inside, her hands shaking but not with fear, with restraint, with the effort of a person trained to absorb punishment and not break. Her eyes burned. But soldiers don't cry. She opened the box. The flag was there. The mug was there. The succulent was dying, its leaves thin and translucent like parchment, like something being erased. She pulled out the flag, feeling the weight of it, the ceremony of it, the memory of it. She thought about throwing it away. Starting over. Disappearing. The mission was over. The trafficking investigation was dead with her termination. She'd failed them. All of them. The intelligence officers who'd placed her. Her own son, who'd trusted her to protect his commanding officer. The memory of the soldier whose flag she was holding. She stood at the edge of the bench, rain soaking through her jacket. The flag was heavy in her hands. One gesture and it would be gone. One moment of surrender and she could stop pretending. She could let this identity die like the succulent, like everything else that had tried to survive in the climate of deception. And then she heard it. The sound carried through the rain like a memory of a different life. Distant at first, then clarifying. The rhythmic percussion of rotor blades cutting through wet air. The sound of a Black Hawk helicopter, maybe 3 miles out, maybe less, moving through the night sky with the purpose of something that had been called for and was coming home. Hannah Clarke lowered the flag. She folded it carefully back into its triangle. She sat back down on the bench. And she waited, because waiting was something she knew how to do, because soldiers understand that rescue doesn't always arrive as you expect it, and sometimes the thing that saves you comes from the sky. The helicopter sound grew louder. Then another joined it. A second Black Hawk. Then a third. The rotor wash shook the streetlights. At the hospital 3 blocks away, someone was asking the question that would change everything. Someone was asking, where is she? Where is the nurse who saved him? And 3 miles out, in a tactical operations center, in a room full of officers who'd been waiting 3 years for her to activate, the answer was already on the way. The rain came sideways that night, the kind that didn't ask permission. Hannah sat at a bus stop 3 blocks from St. Michael's, cardboard box balanced on her lap like it contained something fragile. Inside, a cracked coffee mug with a joke about ER nurses nobody laughed at anymore, a succulent that had given up on living somewhere between Act 3 and Act 5, and beneath them both, a carefully folded American flag. Tan and worn, edges frayed from being pressed against her ribs for 3 years. The flag belonged to Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Garrett. Ramadi, 2008. 19 hours under mortar fire while she held a field hospital together with surgical glue and sheer will, and Marcus had died holding her hand at the end, telling her to keep moving. She was still moving. Just not forward anymore. 3 years. 3,000 days inside St. Michael's pretending to be someone forgettable. Captain Hannah Clarke had evaporated the moment Dr. Pierce's hand signature appeared on the termination letter, and what remained was a woman in scrubs who'd saved too many lives to be trusted and lost her career protecting a mission that was now, officially, dead. The intelligence operation was finished. The trafficking investigation, the one that had cost her cover, her reputation, her access, had collapsed the moment her name got scrubbed from the system. Without her position inside the hospital, the network her handlers had been building a case against went dormant. 2 soldiers were still dead. The ring would shift, reorganize, continue. But she wouldn't be there to stop it. She was just a nurse who'd been fired. The story ended in a rainstorm at a bus stop with a dying plant and someone else's folded flag. The trembling in her hands wasn't cold. It was restraint, the kind that came from wanting to scream and choosing silence instead. Her phone hadn't rung in 6 hours. Not her handlers. Not her son. Not the hospital administrator begging her to come back. The world had moved on. That was the worst part. The absolute worst part was discovering that nobody had actually needed her at all. They'd needed what she could do. They'd needed her steady hands and her military instinct and her ability to save Sergeant Marcus Webb's life in 30 seconds flat. But they didn't need Hannah Clarke. Rain drummed on the shelter roof like fingers on a keyboard, impatient and hollow. The emergency alert came through at 2:02 a.m. Not from her handlers. From the St. Michael's administrative line forwarded to her personal phone, the one she'd almost thrown into the news river on the way to the bus stop. She almost didn't answer. Almost let it ring into voicemail with all the others. But muscle memory was stronger than pride, and her hands moved before her mind caught up. Captain. Not a question. Administrator Walsh, voice tight. We need you back. Now. I don't work there. We know. Doesn't matter. Critical patient just came in via protected witness transport. Gunshot wound, anterior thorax, BP destabilizing. The on-call surgeon is requesting you specifically. He said. Walsh's breath came sharp, panicked. He said you're the only one who's got a chance of walking him out of there. 3 seconds of silence. Rain hammering. Her own breathing. The folded flag on her lap. That's not possible. You don't know who I I know exactly who you are. I've known for 6 months. And I don't care. Get in a cab. You've got 8 minutes before he goes into shock. That's an order, Captain. The line went dead. She was moving before the phone hit the seat. Cardboard box shoved under the shelter, except the flag. The flag went inside her jacket lining where it had lived for 3 years. Where it would stay. The rain hadn't stopped. If anything, it had gotten angrier. Her sneakers hit puddles like gunshots, and when the cab pulled up 45 seconds later, she was already soaked through. The hospital doors opened to chaos. Organized chaos, the kind that meant people were still trying. The ER attendant's eyes went wide when he saw her coming through the trauma bay entrance in wet scrubs and fury. Trauma bay 3, he said. Just said it. Not asked. Knew. She'd never been good at apologies. She was better at action. The moment she pushed through those doors, the on-call resident, a kid named Morrison, couldn't have been more than 30, stepped back like the space she occupied had suddenly become sacred ground. The patient on the table was conscious. Barely. Anterior thorax wound, heavy seepage, abdomen rigid from internal bleeding. Tension pneumothorax was already developing on the right side. She could hear it in his breathing, see it in how his shoulders hunched. No time for introduction. 14-gauge angiocath. Now. Her voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. The room moved. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Get me 2 units of O negative, type, and cross for 4 more. Morrison, hang the rapid infuser. And somebody call cardiothoracic. We're going to need a surgeon who actually knows what he's doing. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping. O2 sat climbed from 61 to 79 to 88. The patient's breathing eased. His eyes opened a fraction wider. And then he looked at her, really looked at her, and the color drained from his face. Angel. One word. Whispered. Accented English, Levantine dialect. Angel of Ramadi. The room went silent. That kind of silence where fluorescent light seemed louder. Morrison's hands froze. The attending nurse took a half step back, like the man on the table had just identified a ghost. Hannah's hands didn't stop moving. Vitals check. Line secured. Fluid running. Her composure was a wall made of concrete and starlight, and nothing was breaking through it. Get him prepped for surgery. Her voice came out with an edge like a tank idling in a garage, all contained power. And somebody better tell me who this patient actually is. The Marine Corps liaison arrived at 3:15 a.m. She recognized the bearing before she saw the uniform, the way he moved through the hospital like he owned every oxygen molecule in the building. He took position at the trauma bay entrance and opened a file folder with fingers that moved like he'd done this 100 times before, which meant he had. Dr. Pierce was already there. Had been waiting in the corridor, watching. Trying to understand. That's a protected witness under federal custody, Pierce said, voice tight. You can't just. The liaison didn't acknowledge him. Eyes locked on Hannah, who was updating medication infusion rates without looking at anyone. The man began reading, each word a bullet point that never missed. Captain Hannah Clarke. The word captain landed like a gavel. Bronze star with Valor. Silence. Silver star, for actions under fire, Ramadi, 2008. The attending nurse's hand went to her mouth. 2 purple hearts. 1 for shrapnel. 1 for third-degree burns sustained while moving injured personnel out of a collapsing field hospital. He turned the citation toward the witnesses gathering at the threshold. For actions in Ramadi where she held a field hospital under siege for 19 hours while 3 Army surgeons worked without rest. For saving 43 lives. For refusing to leave even after her own blood filled her boots. For calling in medevac coordinates while taking fire. 4. This is ridiculous, Pierce said, voice rising. This proves nothing. She's still a fraud. A nurse playing dress up. I don't care what. The two-star general walked in at 3:22 a.m. Not in the file. Not in the reports. Not even in the contingency briefing that nobody was supposed to know about. He was tall in a way that had nothing to do with height and everything to do with a kind of authority that filled rooms before it spoke. His eyes found Hannah immediately. He looked at her the way a commanding officer looks at someone who's already proven they'll take a bullet for the mission, and then he moved. The general's boots clicked across the tile floor. Heel-toe precision. Military gait that meant every step was a message. He stopped in front of Hannah Clarke, who was still checking the full line with fingers that hadn't trembled once, and he came to attention. Hand rising. Salute rendered with a kind of respect that makes grown men cry. Because as his hand came down, Hannah's jacket shifted, and beneath it, visible for the first time in 3 years, was a row of ribbon bars pinned to the lining. Bronze star. Silver star. Purple heart. Purple heart. And below them, the distinctive horizontal stripe of a Navy cross. The room didn't just go quiet. The room held its breath. Hannah Clarke unpinned the ribbon slowly. Carefully. The folded flag came out with them, and when she held both in her hands, the general's eyes closed for a half-second, like he was carrying a weight no uniform could hold. "Welcome home, Captain," he said. Voice like gravel and grace. "Your mission's been activated." The next sound was Dr. Pierce's chair scraping backward as he stood up, face going pale. "What is this?" "Some kind of, this changes nothing. Her credentials are still falsified." "She's still." "Those credentials," the general said without turning around, "were authorized by the Defense Intelligence Agency. Every degree. Every certification. All real. All classified. She was embedded in this hospital for 3 years at captain-level pay, funded by the federal government, with the explicit mission to investigate a trafficking operation that has killed American soldiers." Pierce's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. "And she succeeded," the general continued. "The patient in Trauma Bay 3? Former ISIS operative turned informant. The very same operative who sold the weapons that killed your soldiers. The ones that came through the VA supply chain. The operation Hannah Clarke was tracking is about to collapse because she had access. Because she was trusted. Because she saved lives and asked questions and never broke cover even when you tried to destroy her." Pierce's voice came out strangled. "I didn't know. I was trying to." "I'm aware of what you were trying to do," the general said. And now he turned around. Now he looked at Dr. Richard Pierce the way you look at something you're about to incinerate. You were trying to erase a woman's career because she challenged your ego. You initiated federal investigations into her credentialing. You hired a private investigator. You made calls to board members. You violated about 17 federal statutes in the process. Specifically the part where you attempted to access and forge military records to justify your termination, which is a direct attack on federal personnel under classified assignment. The silence after that wasn't quiet. It was the sound of everything collapsing. "FBI's in the lobby," the general said. "They want to talk about forgery. They want to talk about your phone records and your email. And they want to know why a sitting physician attempted to sabotage a federal military officer in the middle of an active classified operation." Pierce's face went the color of old newspaper. His hand started to shake. The trembling wasn't restraint anymore, it was pure panic, and he tried to back toward the door, but the Marine Corps liaison was already moving to block it. Just standing there. Not saying anything. Not needing to. 2 federal agents in dark jackets appeared at the Trauma Bay entrance at 3:24 a.m. Their badges caught the fluorescent light like small metal suns. The handcuffs clicked. That was the sound that echoed through the hospital. Click, click. Ratcheting tight. Dr. Richard Pierce's face had moved beyond pale into something gray, something hollow. His mouth was working but no words came out, just sounds like a man drowning in air. The agents walked him past the nursing station. Past the 23 hospital staff who'd been watching from the corridors. Past the residents who'd stood silent while he humiliated Hannah Clarke in front of them all. Past the nurses who turned their backs at the vending machine. They looked at him like he was invisible. Which, in that moment, he was. By 4:15 a.m., the hospital board had issued a statement: investigation into Dr. Pierce's termination process, suspension of all his privileges pending federal charges, and most important, a new initiative called the St. Michael's Veteran Care Initiative, funded by federal grant money, to provide pro bono trauma services to service members and veterans. The administrator offered Hannah a position. Director of Trauma Services. Chief of the new VA Liaison Department. Corner Office. Title. Authority. She took a different job. By dawn, she was in Trauma Bay for checking vitals on a 31-year-old who'd come in with a femur fracture. Scrubs. Stethoscope. Hand steady as a surgical laser. Just a captain in nurse's clothing, doing the work that had always mattered most. The job title didn't change anything. The uniform underneath changed everything. At 6:22 a.m., when she finished the vitals check and turned around, her son was standing in the doorway. Not in uniform. Just standing there with the face that looked like hers. Like Marcus Garrett. Like everyone she'd saved and everyone she'd lost. He didn't say anything at first. He just came forward and pulled her into an embrace that felt like 3 years of rain finally finding the ground, and his voice came out broken but whole. "Come home," he said. "After this shift. Just come home." She nodded against his shoulder. The folded flag was in her jacket pocket. But there was another one being raised now. The investigation that would dismantle the entire trafficking network. The soldiers who could be saved. The mission that was only just beginning. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. Thanks for staying with Hannah's story. If this gave you chills, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We're uploading new stories every week, and you won't want to miss the ones coming next. Drop a comment and tell me, would you have walked away, or would you have come back?